Di ba we are told to submit to authority. Yet a lot of times people, before I submit to authority, I need a valid explanation and logic. If it does not make sense, let's battle it out first. Now, when you convince me, then I will submit. Bond slaves are not like that. Their sole purpose was to obey, to do the bidding of the master in all areas. In areas that the master says, gives an explicit instruction, guess what? That bond slave will follow. But in areas that there is no clear instruction, you know what the bond slave does? He finds ways to please the master. I'm reminded, for some of you, you know I like eating. And if there's a hobby I do, it's eating out. I don't shop, I don't watch movies, I just like to eat, right? And you know, when I travel, my wife, my family knows this, I really don't, I just go to museums and eat. I would not buy a shoe more than $30 to $50. Anything above that, I find it expensive. But I would go to a restaurant and pay $100 to $200. I like to eat, and the thing is, you know, I eat in like whatever good serving restaurant, but every so often I want to try the Michelin rated in that area. And to be a Michelin rated restaurant, it means that not only is the food good. Let's say I order, waiter, I want to have a salad, a soup, and a meat, and seafood. A good waiter would ask you, sir, do you want it medium rare? Well, how do you like the doneness? Do you want, what's the side? Blah, 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 blah. Well and good. And if you do that, and your food is really good, it does not mean you'll be rated Michelin star, right? One of the factors that's required to be a Michelin star restaurant is the service is good. Meaning what? Before you ask, they anticipate it and they will serve you. Let's say your wine is slowly dwindling or your water is half empty already. A good restaurant would serve the water and pour already the water, right? A good restaurant, if they see you're not touching the food, the good waiter would come to you and says, sir, is there anything wrong with the steak? Is it overcooked? Is it undercooked? Without even getting a command, they try to anticipate what the master or what the customer wants and tries to respond to that. A good bond slave is similar. It has a singular devotion to the master, trying to anticipate not only will he obey cheerfully without question, he would also try to anticipate the need or the thing that will make the master happy. And the Philippians, when they read that, knew what Paul was implying, knew the thought. Based on our context last week, I wouldn't be surprised if some of them were slaves, right? If you study the book of Romans in the last chapter, chapter 16, it gives you a list of people within the church. And in that church, you'd see that there were people of royalty and bond slaves to the third level, right? And yet they were fellowshipping. So when the Philippians was reading this introduction and they saw that word bond slaves, they knew what Paul was saying. They exactly knew what that meant. Because sabi ko nga, at the start of the Roman Empire, 1/2 of the populations were bond slaves. During the time of Jesus, it was 1/5 or 12 million were bond slaves. Bond slaves normally would expect from their masters food and shelter. their total dependence for food and shelter and the basic necessities will be provided by their masters. So, they're happy. In the States, you see cardboards, right? Will work for food and shelter. I really wonder if that's true. Never tried talking to them. But, if a person was in prison for a long time, especially in the US, they're put in prison for 20, 30 years. I've seen this in a documentary. After 20 to 30 years, what happens? He gets released. Gets out of the jail. No one's there to welcome him back. The family has forgotten them. What does that criminal end up doing? Committing the crime again. Not because he wants to commit the crime, simply because at least in jail he has a food and he has a shelter. And during those times of Jesus, that's one way to become a slave. Some people, they voluntarily choose to be a slave. So the first way to be a slave is when you get occupied and you are auctioned out. The second way is kids of slave. The kids of the slaves, when they're born, they're slaves. The third way is people volunteering to be slaves so that they have at least food and shelter. I'm reminded about the prodigal son. Remember that story, the prodigal son that left? Eventually, he ended up in a Gentile country, far off Gentile country. He had nothing. He begged the man who is a Gentile, please hire me. And the wording there is he was sticking to him. To the point that the man got very annoyed and said, oh, sige, I'll hire you, but you'll stay with my pigs. And you'll eat pig food. And it is at that state that he realized how privileged he was. So similarly, some slaves are enter into slavery because of the food and shelter. But the point here of the concept of slavery here is slaves are totally dependent for their basic need from their master. At the end of the day, a slave will be judged by his master. The opinion of other people, the opinion of the friends of the slaves, the opinion of family members, no matter how good it is, no matter how encouraging it is, does not matter. What matters for the slave is the opinion of one, his master. And if his master is pleased, nothing matters. Everything is good. Why? Because my master said I did a good job. The opinion of the spouse, okay, it's important. A friend, okay, it's important. But it is the master, his voice, his thoughts, his comment, ultimately is what matters for the slaves. And I realize that this concept of slavery is very important. Because, if you study the Bible, the New Testament especially, a lot of the wording there are slavery words. A lot of the parable, remember the parables of Jesus? He left a servant there to manage the different resources. All of them are about servants and slaves. Our Christianity, the reality of our Christianity is intertwined and tied very closely with slavery. I remember in the book of Exodus, remember the Jews went out of Egypt, went out of slavery For what purpose? I think it's in chapter 3 or chapter 4 of Exodus. For what purpose? Not for freedom. They were brought out of slavery from Egypt in order to be slaves to God. That was the purpose. A lot of people think from slavery to freedom. No. From one master to another. That's the movement. When we were slaves to sin before, God saved us not to be free to sin. He saved us so that now we can become slaves to Him. And as we look at verses today, you will see the strong connection of a bondslave to a Christian. What is true of Paul is true for anyone who claims that they are a Christian. The problem nowadays is, do we realize that we are slaves? For us Christians, you might not admit it, but once you become a Christian, you become a bond slave. And the question that we ask only is, are we a good bond slave or a bad bond slave? Go to 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Verse 20, it says, "For you have been bought with a price. So glorify God in your body." Like a slave, right? You have been bought with a price. In fact, it was a priceless price that was bought for your salvation. Exactly like a slave. Go to John chapter 12, please. John chapter 12, verse 26 says, "If anyone serves me, he must follow me. And where I am, there will my servants be also." If you look at the Greek rendering of this verse, the reading of this verse would be, "If anyone serves me, he must follow." That is the emphasis of that verse. He must follow. Like a bond slave who is expected to give complete submission. If anyone serves me, he must follow. And he's not talking here to a bond slave, he's talking to you. He's talking to me. He's not describing a bond slave, he's describing a genuine Christian believer. I remember in John chapter 5, they were accusing Jesus of blasphemy because he was working on a Sabbath. And he said, "You know what? I'm simply doing what my Father is doing. Whatever he does, I just follow." Like a good bond slave. As Christians, we are expected to do the same. Unquestionable obedience to the commands of God. Go to Matthew chapter 6. Matthew chapter 6, verse 24. And it says, "No one can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other." No one. No exception. can serve 2, 3, or 4 masters. What does that imply?